During the East Timor intervention of 1999, while international force peacekeepers deployed across the territory with overwhelming numerical superiority to restore order following post-referendum violence, a 6-man Australian Special Air Service reconnaissance patrol demonstrated what professional forces could accomplish when training, leadership, and tactical discipline confronted numerical disadvantage in western East Timor's remote mountains. This documentary examines the engagement at Idab-Basalala on October 16, 1999, where Sergeant Steven Oddy's patrol encountered more than 60 pro-Indonesian militia fighters in prepared ambush positions and fought through 90 minutes of sustained combat to successful helicopter extraction with 0 Australian casualties. Drawing on declassified operational reports, medal citations, and military analysis, we explore how a small Special Forces team survived circumstances where survival appeared unlikely, and how the tactical lessons from this engagement continue to influence military doctrine. The Australian experience at Aidabasalala offers insights about small unit tactics, counter-ambush operations, and the effectiveness of professional forces that remain relevant to contemporary military operations, demonstrating how rigorous selection, extensive training, and exceptional leadership under pressure can achieve results disproportionate to numerical strength. East Timor occupied a position of strategic importance in the Indonesian archipelago, despite its small size and remote location. The territory had been a Portuguese colony for more than 4 centuries, when Lisbon's authority collapsed during the political upheaval that followed Portugal's Carnation Revolution in 1974. On November 28, 1975, the Revolutionary Front for an Independent East Timor, known by its Portuguese acronym Fretilin, unilaterally declared independence from Portugal. 9 days later, on December 7, 1975, Indonesian military forces invaded the territory, claiming it as Indonesia's 27th province in an annexation that would never gain international recognition. The occupation lasted 24 years and resulted in catastrophic human cost, estimated between 100,000 and 180,000 East Timorese deaths, from violence, starvation, and disease as Indonesian forces attempted to suppress resistance movements and consolidate control over a population that had not chosen integration. The international community, preoccupied with Cold War concerns and reluctant to challenge a regional power aligned with Western interests, did little to address the occupation throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, despite documented human rights abuses. By the late 1990s, however, circumstances had changed. The fall of President Suharto's authoritarian regime in 1998, amid economic crisis and political upheaval, created an opening for policy reconsideration. Under intense international pressure and facing continuing resistance within East Timor, Indonesia's new government agreed to permit a United Nations-supervised referendum on independence. That referendum took place on August 30, 1999, under UN administration with international observers monitoring the voting process. The result was overwhelming and unambiguous. 78.5% of East Timorese voted for independence from Indonesia, rejecting the alternative of special autonomy within the Indonesian state. The margin left no room for interpretation about the population's desires. The vote should have marked a peaceful transition towards self-determination. Instead, it triggered immediate and catastrophic retaliation from pro-Indonesian militia groups backed and often directed by elements of the Indonesian military who refused to accept the outcome. Within days of the referendum result being announced, militia forces launched a coordinated campaign of violence across East Timor, designed to punish those who voted for independence and to destroy the territory's capacity to function as an independent state. The campaign included systematic destruction of infrastructure, with an estimated 70% of buildings burned or demolished, mass killings and executions of independent supporters and suspected Fretilin sympathizers, forced deportations of up to 250,000 East Timorese to West Timor on the Indonesian side of the border, destruction of United Nations facilities, and targeting of international observers who had monitored the referendum. The violence created a humanitarian catastrophe that demanded international response. The United Nations Security Council, confronted with undeniable evidence of systematic violence and ethnic cleansing, authorized the deployment of a multinational peacekeeping force on September 15, 1999. International Force East Timor, known by the acronym INTERFET, received a mandate to restore peace and security, to protect and support the UN mission in East Timor, and to facilitate humanitarian assistance operations throughout the territory. Australia, as the regional power with the greatest capacity to deploy forces rapidly and the most direct strategic interest in East Timor's stability, assumed leadership of the coalition and provided the largest national contingent. The first INTERFET forces deployed on September 20, 1999, establishing an initial presence that would grow to 11,500 personnel from 22 nations at peak strength over the following months. Major General Peter Cosgrove commanded International Force East Timor from its initial deployment in September 1999 through the transition to United Nations administration in February 2000. Born in Sydney on July 28, 1947, Cosgrove had graduated from the Royal Military College Duntroon in 1968, entering military service as the Vietnam War was expanding, and Australian involvement in that conflict was approaching its peak. He served in Vietnam during 1971 with the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, where his performance under fire earned him the Military Cross for gallantry. His subsequent career included command appointments at battalion and brigade level, providing him extensive experience in leading combat formations and understanding the operational requirements of combined arms warfare. By the time he assumed command of INTERFET, Cosgrove brought 3 decades of military experience encompassing conventional warfare, peacekeeping operations, and the diplomatic skills necessary to manage a multinational coalition operating under United Nations authority with complex political constraints. His leadership style was described by those who served under him as personable and accessible, with particular emphasis on direct engagement with soldiers and local populations rather than remaining isolated in headquarters. He walked the streets of Dili, the East Timorese capital, meeting with residents and demonstrating through personal presence that INTERFET forces were there to protect rather than to dominate. The approach proved effective in winning local cooperation and trust. Simultaneously, Cosgrove maintained firm control over military operations, making clear to militia forces that INTERFET possessed both the capability and the will to use force against those who continued violence against the population. The combination of diplomatic engagement and military credibility helped establish INTERFET's authority rapidly across much of East Timor, despite initial uncertainty about how militia forces would respond to the international deployment. The force Cosgrove commanded eventually numbered 11,500 personnel at peak deployment. 22 nations contributed forces. 22 nations contributed forces, ranging from major contingents from Australia, New Zealand, and Thailand to smaller specialized units from countries including the Philippines, South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, and various European nations. The diversity created command and control challenges that required diplomatic skill to manage effectively while maintaining operational coherence. Australian forces formed the core of the deployment, providing not only the largest national contingent, but also the command structure, logistics infrastructure, and key combat capabilities. The force structure reflected a combined arms approach designed for both peacekeeping and combat operations. Acknowledging that militia forces might choose to resist INTERFET deployment rather than accept the referendum outcome peacefully. Infantry battalions provided the ground combat capability to establish control over population centers and conduct patrols throughout the territory. Artillery batteries offered fire support that could respond to attacks on INTERFET positions or provide covering fire for infantry operations if significant resistance developed. Armored personnel carriers gave mobility and protection for troops moving through areas where militia presence remained uncertain. Engineers addressed infrastructure requirements and cleared roads of obstacles or mines that militia forces might employ to restrict INTERFET movement. Helicopter assets, including Black Hawk utility helicopters and Iroquois transport helicopters, provided rapid mobility across mountainous terrain where road networks were limited or had been damaged during the violence following the referendum. Among the specialized elements deployed to East Timor, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment represented the most capable reconnaissance and direct action force available to Cosgrove. Formed on July 25, 1957, based on the British Special Air Service model, the regiment emphasized long-range reconnaissance, unconventional warfare, and small unit operations conducted by highly trained professional soldiers operating with considerable autonomy. The regiment's previous combat experience included operations during the Borneo Confrontation from 1965 to 1966, extensive reconnaissance operations in Vietnam from 1966 to 1971, where SASR patrols had distinguished themselves through their ability to gather intelligence while avoiding unnecessary contact with enemy forces, participation in the First Gulf War in 1991, humanitarian operations in Somalia during 1993, and peacekeeping missions in Rwanda from 1994 to 1995. This operational history meant that by 1999, the regiment possessed institutional experience in both conventional combat and the more complex environments of peacekeeping and humanitarian operations, where rules of engagement were restrictive and political considerations often constrained military options. The regiment was organized into 3 operational squadrons, designated 1 Squadron, 2 Squadron, and 3 Squadron, commonly called Sabre Squadrons, to distinguish them from support elements. Each squadron numbered roughly 120 personnel, organized into troops of 30 soldiers each. These troops deployed operationally in patrols of 4 to 6 operators, with 5-man patrols representing the most common configuration because that size balanced the need for stealth and concealment against the requirement for sufficient firepower and capability to handle various operational tasks if contact with enemy forces occurred. Entry into the SASR was notoriously difficult, with candidates facing a selection course that eliminated roughly 90% of volunteers, regardless of their previous military experience or fitness levels. Those who passed selection then entered a training pipeline extending 18 to 24 months, from initial qualification through to full operational deployment with a squadron. The training emphasized reconnaissance and surveillance, navigation across difficult terrain without technological aids, survival skills for extended operations without resupply, small unit tactics for both avoiding contact and fighting when contact became unavoidable, advanced weapons handling, demolitions, communications, and the physical and mental resilience necessary to operate for days or weeks in hostile territory, where extraction might not be immediately available if circumstances turned dangerous. The investment in each operator meant that SASR personnel represented a resource the Australian military could not afford to squander through careless employment or missions that exceeded their capabilities. Every member of a patrol was a fully qualified Special Forces operator with years of training and experience, creating teams where each individual could function independently if necessary, but where collective capability exceeded what any individual could accomplish alone. In East Timor, SASR squadrons deployed on rotating tours, with each squadron serving roughly 12 months before being replaced by another squadron, whose personnel had completed their training workup and preparation for deployment. The primary mission assigned to SASR elements involved covert reconnaissance of militia activity throughout the territory, with particular emphasis on remote border regions where pro-Indonesian forces maintained presence after the main Indonesian military units had officially withdrawn in mid-September. The patrols operated with minimal military identification, often using civilian vehicles and clothing to maintain low profiles that allowed them to observe and gather intelligence without immediately identifying themselves as military targets or provoking confrontations that might escalate unnecessarily. The intelligence they gathered on militia movements, weapons caches, leadership structures, and base camp locations provided commanders the information needed to deploy conventional infantry units effectively and to understand the militia threat in areas beyond INTERFET's initial deployment. The reconnaissance missions required patience and the discipline to observe enemy activity without engaging. Reporting information through encrypted radio communications to task force headquarters, where intelligence officers compiled the data into pattern analysis that guided operational planning. When patrols did encounter militia forces, rules of engagement authorized the use of force in self-defense or defense of others. But the preference was to avoid contact when possible, since patrol compromise meant intelligence gathering ceased and extraction became necessary. The operational approach reflected lessons from Vietnam, where SASR patrols had operated for days in Viet Cong-controlled territory, gathering intelligence that enabled effective infantry operations while avoiding the set-piece battles that exposed small units to unacceptable risk from numerically superior forces. Sergeant Steven Oddy led one such patrol operating in western East Timor during October 1999. A career SASR soldier with extensive experience, Oddy had progressed through the regiment's demanding selection and training system, accumulating the skills and operational experience that qualified him for patrol leader responsibilities. Specific details about his service history prior to East Timor remain classified for operational security, consistent with Australian Special Forces practice of protecting personnel who have served in covert operations and may continue to serve in sensitive roles. What is documented is that Oddy commanded the respect of his patrol members, possessed the tactical judgment necessary to make life or death decisions under pressure, and demonstrated the leadership qualities that would later earn formal recognition through the award of the Medal for Gallantry from Queen Elizabeth II for his actions during the Idab-Basalala engagement. The identities of the other 5 patrol members have not been publicly disclosed, also for security reasons. Each would have been a fully qualified SASR operator with years of training following successful completion of the selection course, representing the same caliber of professional soldier that Oddy himself exemplified. The 6-man patrol configuration balanced several operational requirements. 6 operators provided enough personnel to establish effective security during halts, to conduct reconnaissance with proper observation techniques, to maintain communications with headquarters, to carry sufficient ammunition and equipment for extended operations, and to provide mutual support if contact with enemy forces occurred. Simultaneously, 6 men remained small enough to move with relative stealth, to insert and extract by helicopter without requiring multiple aircraft, and to conceal their presence in terrain where larger units would be more easily detected through noise or visual signature. The patrol's equipment reflected standard SASR loadout for reconnaissance operations in potentially hostile territory. Primary weapons included F-88 Austere rifles, the Australian variant of the Austrian Steyr AUG bullpup design, chambered in 5.56 mm NATO caliber with 30-round magazines. The F-88 offered reliability in tropical conditions, acceptable accuracy to 300 meters, and sufficient firepower for self-defense, while remaining compact enough for vehicle operations and helicopter insertions. At least one patrol member carried an F-89 Minimi light machine gun, the Australian designation for the Belgian FN Minimi, chambered in the same caliber, belt-fed from 200-round boxes that provided sustained fire capability crucial for suppressing enemy forces if the patrol came under attack. Secondary weapons consisted of Browning 9mm pistols as backup arms. Beyond the weapons themselves, each operator carried multiple loaded magazines, grenades for both fragmentation and smoke effects, and sufficient ammunition to sustain combat for extended periods if extraction was delayed. Communications equipment included encrypted tactical radios that allowed secure voice communications with headquarters and with helicopter assets that might be needed for emergency extraction. Navigation equipment included GPS receivers and traditional map and compass systems as backup if electronic systems failed or batteries depleted. Individual body armor and helmets provided protection against small arms fire and shrapnel, though operators might choose to wear minimal protective equipment if the mission profile emphasized stealth over survivability in direct combat. Medical supplies allowed treatment of casualties until evacuation could be arranged, with each operator trained in tactical medicine appropriate to battlefield injuries. The vehicles, likely civilian-patterned Toyota Land Cruisers or similar 4-wheel drive models, provided mobility while maintaining the low profile appropriate to reconnaissance missions where appearing overtly military might provoke confrontation or compromise the mission before intelligence could be gathered. The mission assigned to Oddy's patrol on October 16, 1999, involved reconnaissance of militia activity in the Aidabasalala area, a remote village in western East Timor's mountainous terrain. Idab-Basalala lay in Bobanaro district, roughly 20 to 30 kilometers from the border with West Timor. The western portion of the island that remained Indonesian territory, and where many militia groups had established bases of operation after withdrawing from areas INTERFET controlled more firmly. The village had strategic significance because of its location along infiltration routes that militia forces might use to move between sanctuaries in West Timor and operational areas inside East Timor, where they could continue to threaten the population and challenge INTERFET's authority. The area had seen limited coalition presence due to its remoteness from major population centers and the difficult terrain that restricted rapid reinforcement if patrols encountered problems. Intelligence indicated militia activity in the region, though specific assessments of enemy strength, dispositions, and intentions remained incomplete. The patrol's mission was to fill those intelligence gaps through careful observation while avoiding contact that might compromise their presence and prevent continued surveillance. The intelligence requirements included identifying militia presence and estimating their strength, locating any weapons caches or supply depots they might have established, assessing local population sentiment and the degree of support or coercion militia forces employed to maintain influence, and reporting on infiltration routes between West Timor and the operational area. The information would guide subsequent INTERFET operations, enabling commanders to deploy forces effectively against identified threats, while understanding the operating environment more completely than fragmentary reports from other sources could provide. By October 1999, pro-Indonesian militia forces operating in East Timor represented a complex and varied threat whose capabilities and motivations differed substantially from the Indonesian military units that had officially withdrawn from the territory following international pressure and the deployment of INTERFET. The militia groups had emerged during the months leading up to the August referendum, formed and equipped by Indonesian military and intelligence services as auxiliaries to resist the independence movement and to intimidate voters. Major militia groups operating in western East Timor included Besi Merah Putih, whose name meant red and white iron in Indonesian, and referenced the colors of Indonesia's flag, Mahidi, an acronym for the Indonesian phrase meaning live or die for integration, Aitarak, meaning thorn, and Laksar, along with numerous smaller groups whose allegiances and operational areas shifted as circumstances evolved. The composition of these forces reflected the complex political situation in East Timor. Some members were East Timorese, who genuinely supported continued integration with Indonesia, believing that independence would bring economic hardship or political instability. Others had been coerced into militia service through threats against themselves or their families, forced to choose between joining or facing violence. Some were Indonesian settlers who had moved to East Timor during the occupation years and feared what independence might mean for their status and property. Others were Indonesian military personnel operating in civilian clothes to maintain deniability while continuing to direct operations after the official withdrawal. This diversity meant that militia capabilities varied dramatically. Some units included former Indonesian soldiers with formal military training and combat experience. Others consisted of poorly trained civilians who had been given weapons and rudimentary instruction, but lacked the discipline and skills of professional soldiers. Equipment was similarly varied, with most fighters carrying AK-47 rifles, the ubiquitous Soviet-designed weapon chambered in 7.62 by 39 mm caliber that had proliferated throughout Southeast Asia during decades of conflict. Some had SKS rifles, older Soviet semi-automatic weapons, or various handguns. The more capable units might possess light machine guns, including RPD or PKM models that provided sustained fire capability. Few had body armor or protective equipment beyond whatever civilian clothing they wore. Communications equipment was limited, with only leaders possessing handheld radios for coordination. The absence of standardized uniforms meant identifying militia members was difficult, since they appeared as armed civilians rather than uniformed combatants, complicating engagement decisions for INTERFET forces operating under restrictive rules of engagement. Behind the militia groups, providing direction and support that explained capabilities beyond what untrained irregulars could typically achieve, stood the shadow presence of Indonesian Kopassus Special Forces. Kopassus, whose name came from the Indonesian phrase Komando Pasukan Khusus, was Indonesia's elite special forces command, comparable to American Green Berets or British SAS in terms of selection, training, and mission profile. The organization had extensive experience in counterinsurgency operations across the Indonesian archipelago having fought separatist movements in Aceh, West Papua, and other regions where Indonesian authority faced armed resistance. Kopassus had a documented history of human rights abuses and covert operations that pushed beyond conventional military boundaries into intelligence operations, political action, and activities that democratic governments would consider inappropriate for military forces. Intelligence available to INTERFET indicated that despite the official Indonesian military withdrawal from East Timor, Kopassus advisors had remained in the territory covertly, providing direction to militia operations, offering tactical advice, and maintaining Indonesian influence through proxies rather than through direct Indonesian military presence that would be obvious and politically unacceptable. Evidence for Kopassus involvement came from the sophistication of some militia operations that exceeded what untrained irregulars could plan and execute, from intelligence capabilities that suggested access to information networks beyond local sources, and from tactical coordination that implied professional military direction rather than ad hoc decisions by militia leaders. The question of whether Kopassus personnel operated merely as advisors or participated directly in operations remained uncertain, with conflicting reports and limited hard evidence. What seemed clear was that at minimum, some militia groups benefited from professional military expertise that made them more dangerous than their irregular status and limited training would suggest. By mid-October, the tactical situation facing INTERFET had evolved significantly from the crisis atmosphere of late September, when the initial deployment occurred. Main Indonesian military forces had withdrawn as promised, removing the possibility of direct confrontation between INTERFET and the Indonesian armed forces that might have escalated into broader regional conflict. Militia forces, initially defiant and active throughout the territory, had been pushed back from major population centers by INTERFET's deployment and demonstration of overwhelming superiority in the few direct engagements that had occurred. The humanitarian crisis was being addressed, with displaced persons beginning to return and infrastructure beginning the long process of reconstruction. The mission was far from complete, however. In remote areas like western East Timor, near the Indonesian border, militia groups maintained freedom of operation beyond INTERFET's immediate reach. Some groups were withdrawing toward West Timor, recognizing that confronting INTERFET directly was futile and seeking sanctuary in Indonesian territory, where coalition forces would not pursue them. Others attempted to maintain presence in remote mountain villages, where they could continue to influence the population through intimidation, and where INTERFET's limited forces could not maintain constant presence. The militia threat had diminished from the immediate post-referendum violence, but had not disappeared. Understanding where militia forces operated, how strong they remained, and what capabilities they retained for offensive action required the kind of detailed reconnaissance that only Special Forces patrols could provide by operating in militia-controlled areas for extended periods. SASR patrols had been conducting such reconnaissance throughout western East Timor since INTERFET deployment began, building an intelligence picture that guided conventional force operations. Oddy's patrol was continuing that mission when it moved into the Aidabasalala area on the morning of October 16. The terrain around Idab-Basalala presented operational challenges that shaped both the patrol's approach and the tactical situation they would encounter. Western East Timor's topography consisted of steep mountains dissected by narrow valleys, with elevations reaching over 1,000 meters in some areas. The mountains were covered with dense tropical vegetation that limited visibility and provided concealment for movement, but also restricted observation and fields of fire if combat occurred. The road network consisted primarily of narrow dirt tracks suitable for four-wheel drive vehicles, but often degraded by erosion and monsoon rains, despite October falling within the dry season. These roads followed valleys and ridgelines where terrain permitted, winding through the mountains in routes that were predictable to anyone familiar with the area, and therefore vulnerable to ambush at numerous locations where vegetation pressed close to the roads and sight lines extended only meters ahead. The dense vegetation meant that forces positioned even 20 meters from a road might be invisible to vehicles passing by until they initiated fire at point-blank range. The steep terrain limited maneuver options if ambushed, since leaving the roads often meant climbing or descending slopes too steep for vehicles and difficult even on foot while carrying combat loads. Weather conditions during October fell within East Timor's dry season, with daytime temperatures reaching 30 to 35 degrees Celsius and humidity remaining high, despite the relative lack of rainfall compared to the wet season months. The heat and humidity created physical stress for dismounted operations and contributed to rapid dehydration that affected combat effectiveness if water intake was not maintained carefully. Visibility was generally good during daylight hours, though afternoon clouds sometimes built up in the mountains, affecting both ground observation and helicopter operations. Flying weather was adequate for helicopter support, an important consideration since extraction by air represented the only realistic option for a compromised patrol in terrain where ground movement back to INTERFET-controlled territory might take days and would be opposed by militia forces throughout. The patrol moved into the Aidabasalala area during the morning of October 16, traveling in their civilian vehicles along the mountain roads, while maintaining the low profile appropriate to reconnaissance operations. The tactical situation was uncertain. Intelligence suggested militia presence, but lacked specifics about numbers, locations, or intentions. Previous patrols in the region had encountered limited resistance, with militia forces generally choosing to avoid contact with INTERFET units, whose firepower and professional capability made confrontation unattractive to forces that lacked training for sustained combat. The assessment was reasonable based on available information and previous experience. It underestimated both the militia capability in this particular area and their willingness to engage in isolated patrol where superior numbers might offset INTERFET's advantages in training and equipment. Whether the militia had specific intelligence about Oddy's patrol or simply maintained ambush positions as a matter of routine, hoping to catch INTERFET forces moving through the area, would never be established definitively. What is clear is that sometime around midday on October 16, the patrol encountered not a small militia element that might be observed and reported, but a substantial force that had prepared an ambush specifically designed to destroy them. The ambush was initiated with small arms fire from multiple positions along the road where the patrol was moving. The size of the militia force was estimated at between 60 and 80 fighters, a concentration suggesting either that multiple groups had assembled for coordinated operation, or that a single large unit had been deployed specifically to this location. The 10-to-1 ratio meant that militia forces could establish overlapping fields of fire from positions on both sides of the road, creating a kill zone where vehicles and personnel would be caught in crossfire from multiple directions with limited ability to take effective cover. The volume of fire was intense, with AK-47 rifles and possibly light machine guns engaging from ranges of 50 meters or less, where the vegetation concealed firing positions until muzzle flashes and sound gave away locations. The tactical situation facing the patrol was dire. They were in the kill zone of a prepared ambush by a force roughly 10 times their size. the narrow road offered limited maneuver space for vehicles. The steep terrain and dense vegetation restricted movement on foot. Remaining in position meant being systematically engaged from multiple directions, with militia forces able to concentrate fire, while the patrol struggled to identify and engage dispersed targets protected by vegetation. The standard response to such circumstances, taking cover and returning fire while calling for reinforcement, was not viable because reinforcement would require at minimum 30 to 60 minutes for helicopter insertion, and the patrol could not survive that long fixed in place under sustained fire from overwhelming numbers. The alternative, attempting to withdraw along the road, meant moving through an ambush that likely extended for hundreds of meters with additional firing positions, waiting to engage as the patrol attempted to extract. Every tactical option appeared to lead to the same result: the patrol being destroyed through sustained fire from multiple directions against which 6 men could not develop sufficient suppressive fire to protect themselves while maneuvering to safety. Sergeant Oddy's assessment of the situation required only seconds, but determined whether his patrol would survive the next minutes. Remaining in the kill zone meant death or capture. Attempting to defend in place allowed militia forces to coordinate their attack and exploit their advantage in numbers, while the patrol consumed ammunition, trying to suppress targets they could barely see through vegetation. The terrain prevented effective dismounted maneuver away from the road. The only option that offered any possibility of survival was to attack directly into the ambush with maximum firepower and violence of action. Attempting to shock the militia with aggressive response they did not expect from a smaller force and break through the ambush positions before militia forces could organize coordinated assault. The tactical doctrine, SASR, trained for these circumstances, emphasized exactly this approach. Counter-ambush drills practiced repeatedly during training taught that small units caught in ambush positions must respond immediately with overwhelming return fire to suppress attackers and create space for movement, then break contact by fighting through the ambush or flanking it rather than attempting to defend static positions where time favored the larger force. The doctrine was based on the principle that small professional units survived through initiative and aggression rather than through passive defense, and that attacking into an ambush with concentrated firepower often shocked irregular forces who expected defensive reactions and were unprepared for counterattack from supposedly trapped victims. Oddy made the critical decision to implement that doctrine despite the overwhelming odds, ordering his patrol to return fire immediately with maximum firepower while maneuvering to break out of the kill zone. The patrol's response was immediate and violent. The F-89 Minimi machine gun opened fire first, its sustained fire capability sweeping across the militia positions with a volume of fire that forced militia fighters to seek cover, even as they attempted to maintain their attack. The concentrated bursts suppressed return fire from positions the gunner targeted. The riflemen with F-88 Austeriors engaged specific targets they could identify through muzzle flashes or movement, firing controlled bursts rather than spraying ammunition wildly in the general direction of enemy fire. The concentration of firepower from 6 weapons, particularly with the machine gun providing sustained suppression, created a volume of fire that exceeded what militia forces expected from such a small unit. The psychological impact was as important as the physical casualties inflicted. Militia fighters who had initiated the ambush, expecting relatively easy victory against an isolated patrol, suddenly found themselves under concentrated fire that killed or wounded comrades and forced those not hit to keep their heads down or risk being engaged by accurate return fire. The patrol's fire discipline maintaining aimed fire while managing ammunition expenditure to sustain capability, contrasted sharply with militia fire that was high in volume but lower in accuracy as fighters fired from cover positions without exposing themselves sufficiently to aim effectively. While maintaining this suppressive fire, patrol members executed coordinated movement under fire, with some providing covering fire while others moved toward vehicles or better positions, then reversing roles in the fire and movement pattern, trained extensively during preparation for deployment. The coordination required no detailed verbal communication because every patrol member understood the drill from countless rehearsals and trusted teammates to execute their roles without needing to be told. The patrol broke out of the initial ambush position, successfully extracting from the kill zone despite the intensity of fire and the disparity in numbers. Several militia fighters were killed according to later assessments, though accurate casualty counts during the chaotic engagement were impossible to determine. Militia fire had been heavy, but inaccurate enough that none of the 6 Australian patrol members were hit, despite the volume of rounds fired at close range. The factors that enabled this extraordinary outcome began with the immediate aggressive response that denied militia forces time to coordinate their attack effectively. The concentrated firepower, particularly from the minimi, forced militia fighters to prioritize survival over aimed fire. The body armor worn by patrol members provided protection that militia lacked, meaning near misses or rounds that struck extremities were less likely to produce casualties than equivalent hits would have caused against unprotected militia. The fire discipline maintained by patrol members meant that despite being outnumbered, their return fire was more effective per round expended than the larger volume but less accurate fire from militia positions. The training that allowed coordinated movement under fire without detailed verbal communication enabled the patrol to maneuver while under attack in ways that untrained forces could not replicate. Breaking out of the initial ambush position did not end the engagement or guarantee survival, however. The patrol now faced a new problem equally dangerous: fighting withdrawal through mountainous terrain where militia forces could establish additional ambush positions along any route the patrol might use to reach extraction zones. The pattern that developed over the next 90 minutes constituted a running battle, unlike the brief engagements more typical of ambush situations, where contact lasted only minutes before one side broke off. The militia forces, despite casualties from the initial contact, demonstrated persistence unusual for irregular forces facing professional opposition. They pursued the patrol, attempting to establish additional ambush positions along the mountain roads that the patrol would need to travel to reach areas where helicopter extraction might be feasible. Whether this persistence resulted from orders by Indonesian advisors who understood the intelligence value of destroying or capturing an SASR patrol, from political motivations to demonstrate militia relevance by scoring a victory against INTERFET forces, or from simple determination to complete what they had started when initiating the ambush, the militia maintained pressure rather than breaking off after the initial contact went badly. The patrol encountered multiple subsequent firing positions over the course of the running battle, with militia forces establishing hasty ambushes along the route or engaging from positions as the patrol attempted to move through terrain that offered numerous locations where concealed fighters could initiate fire against vehicles moving along predictable roads. Each contact followed a similar pattern. Militia forces would open fire from concealed positions, attempting to fix the patrol in place with volume of fire from multiple directions. The patrol would respond immediately with concentrated return fire, particularly from the minimi machine gun, whose sustained fire capability was critical for suppression. While maintaining suppressive fire, patrol members would maneuver to break contact, using fire and movement to extract from each engagement, rather than becoming fixed in defensive positions where time and ammunition depletion would favor the larger militia force. The patrol would then continue moving toward extraction zones, while militia forces regrouped and attempted to establish new positions ahead to intercept the withdrawal. Sergeant Oddy's leadership throughout this extended engagement involved continuous tactical decision-making under circumstances where mistakes meant to use suppressive fire to break contact, to use suppressive fire to break contact, and continue withdrawal. He coordinated communications with headquarters throughout the running battle, reporting the patrol's situation and requesting helicopter extraction, while simultaneously directing his patrol's response to immediate threats. He managed ammunition expenditure, recognizing that the extended engagement was depleting supplies faster than a typical patrol encounter, and that running out of ammunition before extraction arrived would leave the patrol defenseless. He maintained patrol cohesion, ensuring that under extreme stress and physical exhaustion, no one became separated from the group where they might be isolated and overwhelmed. He selected routes that balanced the need to reach extraction zones against the tactical requirement to avoid predictable movement that militia could easily interdict. The burden of command meant that while every patrol member faced life or death circumstances requiring peak performance, Oddy additionally carried responsibility for decisions that would determine whether all 6 men survived or whether the engagement ended in casualties that might have been prevented by different tactical choices. The Medal for Gallantry he would later receive recognized not individual heroics divorced from context, but this sustained performance of leadership responsibilities under extreme pressure over 90 minutes, where any significant error would have catastrophic consequences. The extended nature of the engagement created challenges beyond the immediate tactical problem of surviving each contact. Physical exhaustion accumulated over 90 minutes of sustained combat stress, with adrenaline eventually giving way to fatigue that degraded reaction times and decision-making capacity. The tropical heat, reaching into the mid-30s Celsius, combined with high humidity to create dehydration risk that affected combat effectiveness if water intake was not maintained, despite the difficulty of drinking while under fire. The psychological stress of continuous high-threat environment, where every moment brought possibility of renewed contact, and where awareness of being heavily outnumbered could not be ignored, tested mental resilience and discipline. Ammunition management became increasingly critical as the engagement extended beyond typical contact duration. The Minimi machine gun, essential for providing suppressive fire that kept militia at distance during each contact, consumed ammunition faster than rifles, with 200-round boxes depleting rapidly when sustained fire was needed to suppress multiple enemy positions. Each patrol member had carried multiple rifle magazines and additional ammunition, but extended firefights across multiple contacts steadily reduced those reserves toward levels where conservation became necessary, even as tactical situations demanded heavy fire to break contact successfully. The patrol maintained fire discipline throughout, with patrol members making individual decisions about when to fire and when to hold fire based on whether targets presented themselves and whether suppression was needed at that moment, rather than firing continuously and exhausting ammunition against targets that might not be effectively engaged. The militia forces demonstrated tactical capabilities that exceeded what would be expected from typical irregular forces lacking professional military training. The ability to establish multiple ambush positions as the patrol attempted to withdraw suggested either that forces had been pre-positioned along likely routes, or that militia could move through mountainous terrain parallel to roads faster than vehicles could travel the winding roads, allowing them to establish positions ahead of the patrol's movement. The persistence in maintaining engagement for 90 minutes despite taking casualties indicated leadership control and morale that irregular forces often lack when facing determined opposition from professional troops. The coordination required to conduct multiple sequential ambushes rather than simply breaking contact after initial failure suggested command and control capabilities beyond what militia armed with limited communications equipment would normally possess. These factors reinforced intelligence assessments that Kopassus advisors were involved in directing militia operations in western East Timor, providing the professional military expertise that enabled more sophisticated tactics than militia fighters themselves could have developed independently. Whether Kopassus personnel were directly present during the Aidabasalala engagement, or had merely provided planning and training that militia leaders then implemented, remains unclear from available information. Either way, the engagement demonstrated that some militia elements possessed capabilities that required INTERFET forces to treat them seriously as military threats rather than dismissing them as poorly trained irregulars who would flee when confronted. Throughout the running battle, Oddy coordinated with headquarters regarding extraction, reporting the patrol's position and situation while requesting helicopter support. The headquarters response involved launching a Black Hawk helicopter to execute extraction once the patrol could reach an area suitable for landing. The Black Hawk, a Sikorsky S-70 variant operated by Australian Defence Force, had crew of 4 and capacity to embark the 6-man patrol along with their equipment. The helicopter would need to navigate to the remote mountainous location where the patrol was operating, a flight requiring time measured in tens of minutes from bases where INTERFET helicopters were stationed. The timing created additional pressure on the patrol. They had to keep moving toward extraction zones that offered sufficient clear space for helicopter approach and landing. They had to maintain combat effectiveness through continued contacts to prevent militia forces from overrunning their position before extraction arrived. They had to time their arrival at the extraction zone to coincide with helicopter arrival, since arriving too early meant establishing static defensive position that consumed ammunition while waiting, while arriving too late meant the helicopter might arrive before the patrol secured the zone, or militia might block access to the landing area. The coordination required continuous communication between patrol, headquarters, and helicopter crew, with adjustments to timing and location based on tactical developments as the engagement progressed. The helicopter crew understood they were flying into hostile environment where militia forces were actively engaged, accepting the risks inherent in approaching a hot landing zone where enemy fire might target the aircraft during its most vulnerable moments. After 90 minutes of running battle through multiple contacts, the patrol reached an area suitable for helicopter extraction. The location provided sufficient clear space for helicopter approach and landing, while being accessible to the patrol by vehicle despite militia presence in the general area. Establishing defensive perimeter around the extraction zone, the patrol secured the immediate area against militia forces who remained in contact and attempting to prevent extraction. The 360-degree security meant patrol members positioned themselves to cover all directions from which militia might approach, preventing attackers from closing to effective range during the vulnerable period when the helicopter would be landing and patrol members would be boarding. The suppressive fire maintained by patrol members kept militia at distance, with the minimi continuing to provide sustained fire that forced militia to remain in cover rather than attempting to rush the position. The coordination with the helicopter involved communicating approach vector, landing zone conditions, enemy situation, and patrol readiness, ensuring that aircraft and patrol synchronize their actions for rapid extraction. The helicopter approached at low altitude, descending into the extraction zone with crew aware that militia forces in the area might engage the aircraft with small arms fire during approach or landing. The brief period when the helicopter settled to the ground represented maximum vulnerability for both aircraft and patrol. The helicopter was a stationary target unable to maneuver to avoid fire. Patrol members moving to board were exposed while transitioning from firing positions to aircraft. The militia, recognizing that extraction was imminent, increased their efforts to close distance and concentrate fire. The extraction itself lasted only the minutes required for the Black Hawk to land, for 6 patrol members to board with their weapons and equipment, and for the aircraft to lift off and climb away from the zone. The last-man extraction procedures meant designated patrol members maintained covering fire until their teammates had boarded, then moved to the aircraft themselves, while others provided final suppression from positions inside or near the helicopter. The discipline maintained through this phase was as critical as earlier decisions during the running battle. Panic or poor coordination during boarding could have resulted in casualties, as patrol members exposed themselves while moving to aircraft or as the helicopter remained stationary longer than necessary. The training that prepared patrol members for extraction under fire meant everyone understood their role and executed without requiring detailed instructions while under extreme stress. The helicopter departed rapidly once all personnel were aboard, climbing away from the extraction zone before militia forces could concentrate effective fire against the aircraft. Within minutes, the immediate danger had passed. The patrol was airborne and safely extracted from the engagement area. The militia forces that had pursued them for 90 minutes were left behind without achieving their objective of destroying or capturing the isolated INTERFET patrol. The final tally, when assessed after return to base, documented an extraordinary outcome. 6 Australian soldiers had faced between 60 and 80 militia fighters across multiple prepared and hasty ambush positions over 90 minutes of sustained combat. Multiple militia fighters had been killed, with estimates ranging from several to as many as 10, though accurate counts were impossible during the confused running engagement. Additional militia had been wounded, though numbers were unknown, and they had been removed by their comrades. 0 Australian patrol members had been killed or wounded. All 6 had maintained combat effectiveness throughout the engagement. All weapons and equipment had been recovered, with nothing lost to militia forces. The mission reconnaissance objectives remained unaccomplished, compromised by the contact that forced extraction before intelligence could be gathered. By the measure that mattered most for a reconnaissance patrol encountering overwhelming enemy forces, however, the outcome was unqualified success. The entire patrol had survived circumstances where survival appeared unlikely when the initial ambush was sprung. The factors that enabled survival when facing such overwhelming odds demanded analysis that went beyond simple attribution to luck or enemy incompetence. Rigorous selection and extensive training that produced SASR operators formed the foundation. Only those with exceptional physical capability, mental resilience, and aptitude survived qualification to serve operationally. The training pipeline developed technical proficiency in weapons, tactics, navigation, communications, and the myriad other skills necessary for special operations. Critically, the training also developed the psychological conditioning that allowed operators to function effectively under extreme stress, when immediate decisions determined survival, and when fear or panic would lead to fatal mistakes. Every member of Oddy's patrol represented years of investment in developing capabilities specifically relevant to the situation they faced at Aidabasalala. They had rehearsed counter-ambush drills countless times during training, internalizing the procedures until execution became automatic, even under the stress of actual combat. They had practiced fire and movement until coordination required no verbal communication, with each operator understanding their role and trusting teammates to execute theirs without direction. They had managed stress during training exercises designed to simulate combat pressure, building psychological resilience that translated to actual combat when facing real rather than simulated threats. The training did not make them superhuman or guarantee survival regardless of circumstances, but it provided the skills and mental preparation that enabled effective response when circumstances demanded peak performance. Tactical doctrine provided the conceptual framework that guided decisions during the engagement. SASR counter-ambush doctrine emphasized immediate aggressive response with maximum firepower to suppress attackers and seize initiative despite being outnumbered. The doctrine recognized that small units caught in ambush positions could not afford to become fixed in static. Defense where time favored larger forces that could coordinate attacks and concentrate fire. Survival depended on refusing to accept the tactical situation the ambush created. Instead, attacking into or through the ambush with sufficient violence of action to shock attackers and create opportunity for extraction. The doctrine was based on analysis of historical engagements where small professional units had survived against larger, irregular forces by maintaining initiative through aggression rather than attempting passive defense. Oddy's decision to fight through the initial ambush rather than taking cover and attempting to defend reflected this doctrine applied in circumstances exactly like those the doctrine addressed. Sound doctrine alone was insufficient without trained personnel to implement it, but trained personnel without sound doctrine might have made tactical decisions that were individually reasonable but collectively ineffective for the circumstances they faced. Leadership quality throughout the engagement was decisive in coordinating individual capabilities into collective effectiveness. Oddy's continuous tactical decision-making under extreme pressure kept the patrol moving, fighting, and surviving over 90 minutes when any significant error could have been fatal. His coordination of communications with headquarters ensured extraction support was requested and timed appropriately. His ammunition management maintained capability throughout the extended engagement, despite heavy fire during multiple contacts. His route selection balanced tactical requirements against immediate threats. Most fundamentally, his maintenance of patrol cohesion meant that 6 individuals continued to function as a team rather than fragmenting under stress into individuals concerned only with personal survival. The trust patrol members had in their leader's judgment allowed them to focus on executing their individual responsibilities without questioning whether orders made tactical sense, critical in circumstances where time for debate did not exist and where split-second decisions could not be made by committee. The Medal for Gallantry that formally recognized Oddy's leadership acknowledged not abstract qualities, but specific performance that saved 6 lives through appropriate decisions sustained over time when circumstances offered no margin for error. Equipment advantages, though less dramatic than training and leadership factors, contributed significantly to favorable outcome. The F-88 Austere rifles functioned reliably throughout the engagement without stoppages, despite heat, dust, and sustained fire. The F-89 Minimi machine gun provided sustained fire capability that enabled suppression essential for breaking contact during each ambush. The encrypted radio communications maintained secure contact with headquarters throughout the engagement, without concern that militia might intercept and use information to coordinate attacks. Body armor provided protection that increased survivability when patrol members were exposed during movement under fire. The reliability of Australian equipment contrasted with militia weapons that included AK-47s of uncertain maintenance status and age, some probably dating to Vietnam War era with decades of service-degrading reliability. The lack of body armor meant militia casualties from hits that would have been survivable with protection. Limited or absent communications between militia elements hampered coordination that might have enabled more effective pursuit. These equipment differentials did not determine outcome by themselves, since poorly trained forces with superior equipment routinely lose to professional forces with inferior weapons, but they provided advantages that professional forces could exploit through proper employment. Maintaining fire discipline throughout the engagement multiplied the effectiveness of limited ammunition supplies. The patrol's approach of firing when targets were identified or when suppression was tactically necessary, rather than maintaining continuous fire, regardless of whether shooting accomplished anything useful, meant ammunition lasted through 90 minutes and multiple contacts. The contrast with militia fire, characterized by high volume but lower accuracy and effectiveness, reflected training differences in when to fire and how to aim under stress. Militia fighters fired more rounds during the engagement, but probably achieved lower hit percentages because rounds were fired from covered positions without proper aim or at excessive ranges where effectiveness drops significantly. The patrol's concentrated fire, particularly from the minimi during critical moments, achieved suppression with fewer rounds expended through accuracy and proper employment rather than through sheer volume. Ammunition management is often overlooked in analysis of combat engagements because training exercises typically allow unlimited ammunition resupply. But in actual combat, where resupply is impossible, the ability to maintain capability through fire discipline often determines outcomes. Unit cohesion and mutual trust transformed 6 individuals into a team whose collective capability exceeded the sum of individual competencies. The shared selection experience created bonds between operators who had endured identical hardships and understood that everyone present had met the same standards. Years of training together built familiarity with each operator's strengths, weaknesses, and likely reactions under stress. Previous operations in East Timor before the Aidabasalala engagement had tested the patrol under less extreme circumstances, building confidence in each other's reliability. This cohesion meant that during the engagement, each operator could focus on their immediate responsibilities while trusting that teammates would handle theirs without supervision. The fire and movement that enabled breaking contact during each ambush required that operators providing covering fire trust. Those maneuvering would reach positions where they could provide covering fire in return, and that those maneuvering trust those providing cover would maintain suppression that prevented militia from engaging them effectively during movement. The coordination happened without detailed verbal communication, because training had internalized the procedures, and trust eliminated the need for constant verification that others were performing as expected. This trust was particularly important under the psychological stress of combat, where uncertainty and fear could degrade performance if operators doubted whether their teammates would execute effectively. From the militia perspective, the engagement demonstrated the gulf between irregular forces and professional special operations soldiers when circumstances demanded sustained combat capability. The militia advantage in numbers should have been decisive in ambush situations where prepared positions and overlapping fields of fire typically allow larger forces to destroy smaller units before they can effectively respond. The militia had initiated the engagement with tactical advantage, had maintained pursuit over 90 minutes demonstrating persistence, and had established multiple ambush positions showing capability beyond simple harassment. Despite these advantages, and despite having professional Indonesian advisors who presumably understood INTERFET capabilities and could have prepared militia more effectively, the militia failed to inflict any casualties while suffering multiple killed and wounded themselves. The failure reflected fundamental weaknesses in training, equipment, cohesion, and tactical employment that numerical superiority could not offset. Militia fighters lacked the marksmanship training that enables effective fire under combat stress. Their weapons, while adequate in technical specifications, were not maintained to standards that ensured reliability during sustained use. They lacked body armor that might have reduced their casualties when return fire hit them. Their fire discipline was poor, with high ammunition expenditure achieving limited suppression or casualties against protected targets. Their coordination was insufficient to prevent a smaller force from breaking contact repeatedly, despite militia attempts to fix them in place. Most critically, their morale was inadequate to sustain attacks against determined opposition that inflicted casualties, with militia forces unable or unwilling to close to ranges where their advantage in numbers could have been brought to bear decisively through assault rather than standoff fire exchanges. The immediate intelligence value of the engagement to INTERFET was significant despite the patrol's reconnaissance mission remaining incomplete. The contact confirmed that militia forces in western East Timor retained both capability and will to engage INTERFET patrols, contradicting assessments that militia were completely defeated and withdrawing to Indonesian territory. The size of the militia force, 60 to 80 fighters concentrated in one location, indicated that substantial militia elements remained operational rather than having fragmented into ineffective remnants. The sophistication of multiple coordinated ambush positions suggested professional military direction, reinforcing intelligence about continued Kopassus involvement, despite official Indonesian withdrawal. The persistence of militia pursuit over 90 minutes demonstrated morale and discipline beyond what defeated irregular forces typically retain. These findings influenced subsequent INTERFET operations in western regions, validating the importance of reconnaissance before committing conventional forces and confirming that areas distant from major INTERFET bases could not be assumed secure without verification. The engagement also validated tactical procedures and force capabilities. The aggressive counter-ambush doctrine was effective in circumstances it was designed to address, building confidence that similar tactics would succeed if other patrols encountered ambushes. The helicopter extraction capability, tested under hostile conditions at Aidabasalala, demonstrated that isolated patrols could be recovered even from remote areas with militia presence, providing assurance that enabled continued reconnaissance operations despite risks. The performance of SASR personnel under extreme circumstances reinforced the value of Special Forces capabilities for operations in environments where conventional forces might suffer unacceptable casualties or fail to accomplish missions requiring stealth and small unit capability. For militia forces and their Indonesian advisors, the engagement provided a demonstration that challenging INTERFET patrols directly was futile even when circumstances appeared favorable. The failure to destroy or capture an isolated 6-man patrol, despite overwhelming advantage in numbers, prepared positions, and 90 minutes to accomplish the mission, showed that INTERFET training and capability advantages were too substantial to overcome through numbers alone. The psychological impact on militia morale was probably significant, as forces that had expected relatively easy victory found themselves unable to prevail despite every apparent advantage. The losses suffered, with multiple killed and wounded for no gain, reinforced the lesson that direct confrontation with professional INTERFET forces produced casualties militia could not afford to sustain. The trend already developing by mid-October, with militia increasingly avoiding contact and withdrawing from areas INTERFET patrolled, accelerated as word of engagements like Aidabasalala spread through militia networks. By late October and into November 1999, organized militia resistance throughout East Timor had largely collapsed, with most groups either withdrawing across the border to West Timor or dispersing to avoid INTERFET forces whose presence had made continued operations impossible. The successful INTERFET operation achieved its mandate of restoring security, enabling the transition to United Nations administration that occurred in February 2000, when the International Force East Timor formally transitioned to the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor. The broader East Timor operation proceeded toward its successful conclusion over the months following the Idab-Basalala engagement. INTERFET forces expanded control throughout the territory, deploying to remote areas as force levels increased toward the peak of 11,500 personnel from 22 nations. Humanitarian assistance operations addressed the immediate crisis, with displaced persons returning and infrastructure beginning reconstruction. Despite the massive destruction militia forces had inflicted during the post-referendum violence. The transition to UN administration in February 2000 marked the end of INTERFET's mandate, replaced by UN peacekeeping forces that would oversee East Timor through the final years of preparation for full independence. On May 20, 2002, East Timor formally gained independence, becoming the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste with Xanana Gusmao, the resistance leader who had spent years imprisoned by Indonesian forces, elected as the first president of the new nation. Australian forces remained involved in East Timor security through various UN missions until 2013, providing continuing support for a nation whose independence had been secured through international intervention. The INTERFET operation was widely assessed as one of the most successful UN-authorized military interventions, achieving its mandate within the timeline established, transitioning smoothly to UN administration, and enabling East Timor's path to independence without the extended conflict that might have occurred had international forces not deployed. Within the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, the Idab-Basalala engagement became part of unit history and tradition, exemplifying the regimental standards and capabilities that distinguished SASR operations. The engagement connected to the regiment's Vietnam legacy, where patrols had operated for days in hostile territory, gathering intelligence while avoiding unnecessary contact, demonstrating that those capabilities remained relevant decades later in different circumstances. The outcome validated selection and training standards, providing tangible evidence that the rigorous requirements and extensive preparation produced operators capable of exceptional performance when circumstances demanded it. The Medal for Gallantry, awarded to Sergeant Steven Oddy, provided formal recognition of leadership under extreme pressure, acknowledging that his tactical decisions and coordination had saved 6 lives through appropriate responses sustained over time when any significant error could have been fatal. Whether other patrol members received recognition is not publicly documented for security reasons. Within the regiment, the engagement was used in training to illustrate counter-ambush procedures, small unit tactics, and leadership under pressure, becoming a teaching example for new operators learning the skills and mindset necessary for operational deployment. The story reinforced regimental culture, emphasizing professionalism under pressure, aggressive response to threats, and the importance of training quality over numerical strength. The influence of the Idab-Basalala engagement extended beyond the SASR to affect Australian Defence Force thinking more broadly. The successful employment of special forces in peacekeeping operations, conducting reconnaissance that enabled effective conventional force deployment while maintaining ability to survive direct combat if encountered, validated the role of elite units in stabilization missions that were becoming more common as the international community confronted post-Cold War conflicts. The engagement contributed to ADF reputation for professional, effective military operations that accomplished missions while minimizing casualties, enhancing Australia's credibility in regional security discussions and coalition operations. The demonstration that small numbers of highly trained forces could operate effectively in hostile environments influenced resource allocation decisions about maintaining expensive special forces capabilities despite their small size compared to conventional units. For military professionals studying the engagement, whether in Australia or in allied nations with their own special forces, the tactical lessons reinforced doctrinal principles about counter-ambush operations, fire and movement, small unit leadership, and the value of training quality in determining combat outcomes. Special Forces training programs in multiple nations incorporated analysis of the engagement as a case study in effective small unit tactics under extreme circumstances. The engagement influenced international thinking about peacekeeping operations and the role of special forces in stabilization missions. The INTERFET operation overall, including the Aidabasalala engagement as one element among many successful operations, became a model for UN-authorized interventions in humanitarian crises. The operation demonstrated that multinational coalitions could deploy effectively when led by capable regional powers with clear mandates and sufficient force to accomplish missions without relying on the consent of parties who benefited from continued violence. The success validated the principle of responsibility to protect that was emerging in international relations theory. The concept that sovereignty did not shield governments or their proxies from international intervention when massive human rights violations occurred. The engagement specifically illustrated that peacekeeping forces required robust military capabilities, not merely lightly armed observers, when operating in environments where hostile forces retained capability to challenge international presence. The clear rules of engagement that authorize self-defense while minimizing civilian harm provided a model for subsequent operations where forces needed to balance defensive capability against the requirement to avoid escalation. These lessons influenced peacekeeping operations in subsequent conflicts, though implementation varied based on political will and available resources. Academic study of the Aidabasalala engagement remains limited due to operational security that continues to protect many details about SASR procedures, patrol member identities, and specific tactical methods employed during the engagement. The classified nature of special operations means that researchers lack access to detailed after-action reports, communications transcripts, and individual statements that would allow comprehensive reconstruction of events. What has entered the public domain through medal citations, limited official statements, and general descriptions of SASR capabilities provides enough information for basic understanding, but leaves many questions unanswered about specifics that military professionals and historians would find valuable for detailed analysis. The limited academic literature means the engagement is often overlooked in studies of the East Timor intervention that focus on the broader INTERFET deployment and political aspects of the crisis rather than on tactical-level military operations. Among military historians and analysts who have examined the engagement, consensus exists that it represents a clean example of effective small unit tactics under extreme pressure, with training, leadership, and doctrine combining to enable survival in circumstances where those factors were tested to maximum. The engagement appears in professional military education as a teaching case, though details available to students remain constrained by classification. The limitation on detailed study is unavoidable given operational security requirements, but it means that public understanding of the engagement remains incomplete decades after it occurred. The human dimension of the Aidabasalala engagement, the experience of 6 soldiers facing overwhelming odds across 90 minutes of sustained combat, remains largely protected from public examination by operational security requirements appropriate to Special Forces personnel who might continue to serve in covert roles after completing any particular deployment. The 5 patrol members beyond Sergeant Oddy have never been publicly identified, their service recognized within the regiment and among those who have access to classified records but protected from public disclosure that might compromise their security or that of their families. Sergeant Oddy himself has maintained operational security in the limited public comments he has made about the engagement, emphasizing the professionalism and training of his patrol members rather than focusing on individual heroics that make better stories, but misrepresent how professional military teams actually function. The approach reflects SASR culture that de-emphasizes individual glory in favor of team effectiveness and mission accomplishment, a culture that recognizes individual skill but understands that special operations succeed through collective capability rather than through lone warriors operating independently. What can be understood about the human experience without access to detailed personal accounts comes from general knowledge of combat stress, leadership demands, and the physical and psychological challenges of sustained high-threat environments. The physical conditions during the engagement created stress that affected performance even for highly trained operators. The tropical heat, reaching into the mid-30s Celsius with high humidity despite the dry season, caused rapid dehydration and physical exhaustion when combined with the stress of combat operations. The weight of weapons, ammunition, body armor, and equipment became increasingly burdensome over 90 minutes of movement and combat. The noise of sustained small arms fire from multiple weapons at close range, though operators wore hearing protection when possible, created auditory stress that degraded communication and situation awareness. Dust and debris from weapons fire and vehicle movement reduced visibility and added to physical discomfort. The terrain, requiring movement through mountainous areas along roads that wound through valleys, added physical challenges to tactical difficulties. These conditions tested physical fitness and endurance that selection and training had developed, with operators required to maintain peak performance despite accumulating fatigue that in other circumstances would justify rest, but that combat operations permitted no time to address. The psychological stress of continuous high-threat environment over 90 minutes created mental demands distinct from physical challenges. Militia forces outnumbered the patrol militia. Forces outnumbered the patrol could not be ignored, creating psychological pressure from understanding that being overwhelmed remained possible despite successful responses to previous contacts. The responsibility each patrol member felt for their own survival and for supporting teammates, the knowledge that individual failure to perform effectively might result in casualties among brothers they had trained with for years, added emotional weight to tactical decisions. The isolation from immediate support, the understanding that no reinforcements would arrive and that survival depended entirely on the patrol's own actions, removed the psychological comfort that soldiers in larger units derive from knowing backup exists if their unit encounters problems it cannot handle. For the patrol leader, these stresses were compounded by responsibility for all 6 lives. by the burden of making tactical decisions that determined whether everyone survived or whether errors resulted in casualties that might have been prevented. The extraordinary outcome, 6 men surviving without casualties against overwhelming odds, testified to the psychological resilience that selection and training had developed, and that was sustained through 90 minutes when any breakdown in discipline or performance might have been fatal. The transition from extreme danger to safety during the helicopter extraction occurred within minutes, creating psychological challenges in processing the sudden shift from combat to survival. For soldiers in sustained combat operations who gradually move from front line to rear areas with time to decompress, the transition from danger to safety can be managed psychologically through staged withdrawal that allows emotional processing. For special operations personnel extracted directly from combat by helicopter, the transition is nearly instantaneous, with operators under fire one moment and safe aboard aircraft minutes later. This abrupt shift, while obviously preferable to remaining in danger, creates cognitive dissonance as psychological systems designed to maintain peak performance under threat suddenly have no threat to respond to, but remain in heightened state that takes time to normalize. The pattern is common in special operations where helicopter insertion and extraction create sharp boundaries between safe base areas and high-threat operational areas. With no gradual transition zone, the adjustment requires psychological resilience that training develops and that experience with previous operations reinforces. But even experienced operators report that immediate transitions from combat to safety feel surreal and require conscious effort to process emotions and reactions that combat conditions forced into background awareness, but that emerge once immediate danger passes. The formal recognition provided through Sergeant Oddy's Medal for Gallantry acknowledged exceptional leadership that saved lives through appropriate tactical decisions sustained over time under extreme pressure. Established in 1991 as part of Australia's honours system, the Medal for Gallantry recognizes acts of gallantry in action in hazardous circumstances. The medal ranks between the Star of Gallantry, which recognizes acts of great heroism, and the Commendation for Gallantry, which recognizes acts of gallantry in action. The selection of Medal for Gallantry for Oddy's actions reflected assessment that his leadership during the engagement met the criteria of exceptional gallantry in hazardous circumstances without necessarily rising to the level of great heroism that would justify the higher award. The citation, while necessarily limited in detail by operational security, recognized that Oddy's tactical decision-making and coordination under fire had enabled the patrol's survival and successful extraction, despite overwhelming enemy numerical superiority. The presentation by Queen Elizabeth II provided the highest level of recognition, with the British monarch still serving as Australia's head of state in her role as Queen of Australia until the end of her reign. The award ceremony, whenever it occurred following the East Timor deployment, marked formal acknowledgement of actions that might otherwise have remained classified and unknown beyond military circles. The legacy of the Idab-Basalala engagement, viewed from the perspective of more than 2 decades since October 16, 1999, encompasses multiple dimensions extending beyond the immediate tactical success. For the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, the engagement remains a defining moment that validated capabilities and reinforced institutional culture, emphasizing professionalism under pressure. For the broader Australian Defence Force and international Special Forces communities, the engagement provided lessons about small unit tactics, counter-ambush procedures, and the effectiveness of properly trained professional forces that continue to inform doctrine and training. For the East Timor intervention overall, The engagement was one element in a successful operation that enabled the territory's transition to independence, demonstrating that international intervention could succeed when properly resourced and led with clear mandate. The engagement contributed to debates about military force structure, the role of elite units, resource allocation between special operations and conventional forces, and the appropriate employment of military capabilities in peacekeeping and stabilization operations that became more common after the Cold War ended. 25 years later, the principles demonstrated at Aidabasalala remain valid even as technology and tactics evolve, because the fundamental factors that enabled survival rigorous selection, extensive training, sound doctrine, superior equipment, and exceptional leadership represent timeless elements of military effectiveness that transcend specific conflicts or technological eras. The engagement demonstrated conclusively what properly trained small units could accomplish when training quality, equipment reliability, tactical doctrine, and leadership effectiveness combined to create capabilities that outweighed numerical disadvantage. 6 soldiers survived contact with between 60 and 80 militia fighters across 90 minutes, not through luck or enemy incompetence, but through systematic advantages developed over years of selection and training, and employed through appropriate tactical decisions made under extreme pressure. The outcome validated investment in special forces capabilities, demonstrated the value of rigorous selection despite high failure rates, confirmed that extensive training pipelines produced operators capable of exceptional performance, and showed that sound doctrine enabled effective response to circumstances where doctrine was tested to maximum. For military institutions worldwide studying effective special forces operations, the engagement offered a clear example of principles successfully applied, with training enabling tactics, tactics following doctrine, doctrine guiding leadership, and leadership coordinating team effort into successful outcome. The fact that the engagement involved a peacekeeping operation rather than conventional war demonstrated that special forces capabilities remained relevant across the spectrum of military operations, from high-intensity combat to stabilization missions, where political constraints limited options, but where capability to survive and prevail if attacked remained essential. The 6 soldiers who fought their way out of the ambush at Idab-Basalala on October 16, 1999, demonstrated through their survival what professional military forces worldwide strive to achieve through selection, training, doctrine, and leadership development. Their experience validated the principle that small professional units properly prepared and appropriately employed can prevail even when circumstances favor adversaries, that training quality outweighs numerical quantity when both sides have access to competent leadership and adequate equipment, and that exceptional individuals organized into cohesive teams and led by competent commanders can accomplish missions that would be impossible for less capable forces, regardless of numbers. The tactical lessons from the engagement, the emphasis on aggressive counter-ambush response, the importance of fire superiority through concentrated firepower, the necessity of fire and movement to prevent becoming fixed in defensive positions, the value of communications for coordinating extraction, and the criticality of ammunition discipline during extended engagements entered the permanent corpus of military knowledge about small unit operations. The human lessons about leadership under pressure, about trust between team members enabling distributed decision-making, about the psychological resilience necessary to function effectively during sustained high-threat situations, and about the transition from combat to safety and its processing challenges, informed understanding of what combat demands from soldiers beyond technical skills. The strategic lessons about the appropriate employment of special forces in peacekeeping environments, about the necessity of robust military capability, even in stabilization missions, and about the value of professional volunteer forces compared to larger conscript armies when quality enables capabilities that quantity cannot replicate, influence military force structure debates and resource allocation decisions. The engagement at Aidabasalala, though small in scale and brief in duration, measured against the broader East Timor intervention and decades of subsequent military operations, represented a moment when principles were tested under circumstances where failure would have been understandable and survival required exceptional performance sustained across time when any significant error meant death. That 6 professional soldiers survived through training, doctrine, leadership, equipment, and determination, rather than through fortune or enemy failure, validated everything that military institutions invest in developing elite capabilities, proving that when circumstances demand maximum performance, proper preparation enables ordinary humans to accomplish extraordinary results through teamwork, discipline, and refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat appears inevitable.